The president ordered a royal guard to salute him, expecting his father's name to open every door like it always had back home. But the guard's response, he didn't raise a hand. He didn't even acknowledge the demand. He didn't so much as blink. And what happened next left an entire courtyard dead silent and reminded a privileged son that some things in this world simply cannot be bought, bullied, or inherited. Want to know exactly how it unfolded? First, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. You know those particular London afternoons where the sky hangs like hammered pewter and there's just enough wind to make the Union Jack snap lazily above Buckingham Palace? There are certain afternoons in London that feel scripted, grey skies hanging like theatre curtains, a restless wind teasing the Union Jack above Buckingham Palace, and tourists clustered shoulder to shoulder, phones held high, waiting for a glimpse of tradition. On this particular day, that familiar rhythm was about to be disrupted. The gates of Buckingham Palace creaked open to welcome a convoy that didn't belong, sleek black SUVs that seemed less like vehicles and more like statements. Their glossy, armored surfaces reflected the pale light like obsidian. Even from a distance, their presence announced something important, or at least something that thought itself important. The lead vehicle came to a deliberate stop. And tourists instinctively raised their phones higher. Out stepped the president's son. Clad in a sharply tailored navy coat and his signature crimson tie, he walked as if the gravel beneath him had been rolled out for his benefit alone. At 39, he carried himself with the entitled confidence of a man who had never been denied a door, a seat, or an audience, with a glance that seemed to assess the palace's real estate value more than its historical significance. He muttered to an aide, loud enough to be overheard by staff nearby, "Still doing the medieval cosplay thing, huh?" The disdain was casual, practiced. Nearby staff exchanged polite but frozen smiles. A British diplomatic liaison approached. Graceful and composed, welcoming him with the kind of poise refined through years of hosting heads of state. "Mr. President's son, if you'll follow me to the designated viewing area." He waved her off, uninterested in protocol. "No need, sweetheart. My father had tea with the Queen. Sat in rooms your ministers only dream of." His entourage exchanged the kind of glances shared by people long accustomed to smoothing over international incidents. And then, brushing past all ceremony, he veered off the path, toward the heart of the courtyard where ceremony becomes sacred. He didn't ask permission. He didn't hesitate. He simply acted as if rules were made for others. The tourists stirred. Phones rose. A collective intuition swept the crowd. Something inappropriate, maybe even historic, was about to unfold. At the center of the palace courtyard stood a figure in scarlet, a still silhouette beneath a bearskin hat, rifle fixed at attention, eyes locked in the distance. To the uninformed, he might have looked like a prop in a royal pageant. To those who knew better, he was the embodiment of discipline, Sergeant Dominic Ware. 34, Coldstream Guards, had held his post for nearly an hour. Unmoving. Unblinking. His crimson tunic was pressed to geometric precision, boots so polished they mirrored the gray sky. His focus, unchanging. His silence, total, but Sergeant Ware was no ceremonial puppet. He was a combat veteran who had endured 2 tours in Afghanistan. At Camp Bastion, during a coordinated Taliban assault, he had held his post under mortar fire until every life in his care was safe. In Gursk Valley, he manned a critical checkpoint alone for hours under fire, knowing that abandoning it would cost lives. This wasn't just ceremony. This was a man forged in war, shaped by duty, standing in quiet defiance of everything the president's son represented. And yet, the president's son approached him like a museum visitor gawking at an exhibit. "Is he even real?" he said, gesturing casually. "Maybe an animatronic? Would be nice if they programmed in some blinking." Nervous laughter came from his aides. The crowd stiffened. A small child whispered, "Is that man allowed to be over there?" No one answered. But everyone knew the answer. The president's son kept walking, closer now, arms folded, tone louder. "Incredible commitment to the bit," he said. "I mean, this guy's really selling it. Almost believable." Still, Ware did not blink, and that's when the dynamic began to shift, not in volume, but in weight. This was no longer amusing. This was a man used to being obeyed, colliding with a man who could not be moved. The president's son wasn't used to being ignored. His voice sharpened with frustration masked as charm. "Come on, you salute your commanders, right? Marines, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, I've been saluted by them all. Even a French general once. Why not you?" He mimed a salute, theatrical and off-key, more parody than respect. The crowd, once murmuring, had fallen into complete silence. A woman clutched her child's hand. A veteran in a worn blazer shook his head and muttered, "That one held the line at Bastion. Mortar fire. Never flinched." The crowd's gaze shifted. A boy, barely 9, lifted his small hand in a salute, not to the visitor, but to the silent guard. His sister followed. Then their father. The ripple moved through the crowd like a wave of quiet resistance, but the president's son remained oblivious, too consumed by his own expectations. "What, you think you're better than me because you can stand still? You think not blinking makes you more important than the son of a president?" The entitlement hung thick in the air. Behind him, phones filmed, not out of curiosity now, but a need to record the moment power revealed its weakness, and then came the voice. Sharp. Clear. Commanding. "Sir." Captain Eliza Hardwick emerged, posture straight, voice razor-edged with restrained authority. "You are in a restricted ceremonial area. I must ask you to return to the designated viewing path." The president's son turned, feigning charm. "Relax, Captain. I'm just encouraging a little international camaraderie." Her response cut deeper than a blade. "Respect is not demanded. It is earned. And you are not showing any." The president's son didn't retreat. If anything, he doubled down, gesturing toward the guard with a dismissive flick. "Their duty is to stand there and look impressive for tourists. I'm asking for 30 seconds of basic human interaction." A friendly nod between allies. Captain Hardwick didn't flinch. "Their duty," she replied, her voice cool and unwavering, "is to preserve the dignity and discipline of the crown. Not to perform on command." As she spoke, another Coldstream Guard stepped silently into place, not aggressive, just present. A reminder, no guard stands alone. Behind that stillness stands a centuries-old institution built on order, sacrifice, and principle. The president's son's eyes darted between them. His confident stance began to falter, shoulders tightening as he sensed the mood shifting against him. His voice raised, not with power, but panic. "This is being blown completely out of proportion. All I wanted was a salute." Captain Hardwick stood unshaken. "Diplomacy," she said slowly, "is not about harassing soldiers into gestures they are forbidden to give. It is about respecting the rules of another nation, even when they are not your own." The courtyard had gone completely silent now. Not out of awe, but out of something deeper, recognition. This wasn't about politics anymore. This wasn't about a name. It was about the line between earned respect and assumed superiority. A little girl's voice, innocent and clear, pierced the stillness. "Why won't he leave the soldier alone?" And from her mother, quiet but firm, "Because no one ever told him no before." The word struck harder than any official reprimand. The crowd remained silent, not out of obedience, but out of quiet alignment with a truth they had just heard out loud. The flush on the president's son's face wasn't embarrassment, it was the unfamiliar sting of being dismissed. By the officer, by the crowd, and most painfully, by the man who wouldn't even look at him. Sergeant Ware hadn't flinched. He hadn't blinked. He hadn't acknowledged the disturbance in front of him with so much as a breath. His silence had said everything. As the weight of his own irrelevance began to settle in, the president's son tried one last time. "Seriously?" he asked, voice cracking. "You're all going to ignore me? I've dined with heads of state. Built million-dollar companies. My father, sir," Captain Hardwick cut in once more, calm and absolute, "you are a visitor who has forgotten where he is, and what behavior is appropriate here." Palace security, until now waiting discreetly, stepped forward. Not with aggression, but with finality. Two silent officers flanked the president's son, giving him a choice: walk away on his own, or be escorted with none of the dignity he so craved. He looked around one last time. The guard unmoved. The crowd unified in their silence. The weight of centuries pressing back against him like a wall. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, voice small. "Over a simple request." Then, louder, "One last attempt to wound what he couldn't control. This whole country's stuck in the past. No wonder you needed us to save you twice." The insult echoed. But no one took the bait. No one rose to anger. No one even blinked. The silence that followed was more devastating than outrage. He had made his final misstep, and been answered not with fury, but indifference. As the president's son was escorted toward the gates, the air remained still. Not with tension, but with clarity. The weight of the moment settled like dust on stone. Then, something remarkable happened. The old veteran near the center of the crowd, his blazer worn, his hand steady, raised a solemn salute. Not to the departing figure. Not to the political name. But to the man who had stood unwavering through it all. The gesture moved outward like a ripple. The young boy who had saluted before lifted his hand again, this time with confidence. His sister followed. Then their parents. The teenager with purple hair. The university student. The suited businessmen. One by one, the crowd offered quiet, improvised tributes, not to wealth, fame, or family connection, but to discipline, to service, to strength without spectacle. Captain Hardwick stood back, her expression carefully neutral, though something behind her eyes hinted at quiet pride. She stepped forward, just enough to speak within regulation distance, and said softly to Sergeant Ware, exemplary bearing under pressure, "Sergeant." The regiment would be proud. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Protocol didn't allow it, but in that perfect stillness, a message passed between them. Soldier to soldier. Professional to professional. Guardian to guardian, and as the palace ceremony resumed, tunic scarlet, boots striking ancient stone, the moment folded into history. The tourists stayed a little longer. Their eyes had changed. What once seemed like mere pageantry now revealed itself for what it truly was, a silent, living symbol of earned authority. The motorcade slipped back into the rhythm of London traffic, swallowed by the city's grey pulse as if the incident had never occurred. But within the palace courtyard, a new kind of stillness lingered. Sergeant Ware had not moved. He had not spoken. The presence of celebrity, of political lineage, of inherited influence, it had all passed before him like wind across stone. And now, with the disruption gone, the changing of the guard resumed. The soldiers emerged in perfect formation, scarlet tunics gleaming, black boots meeting stone in synchronized cadence. It was a choreography of legacy, each movement a note in a centuries-old anthem of order. Yet today, every step seemed to carry new weight. The tourists no longer viewed the spectacle as mere tradition. They had seen the purpose beneath the pageantry. Phones lowered. Conversations fell quiet. Faces turned toward the ceremony not with curiosity, but with reverence. Among them stood the same young boy who had saluted the guard. He watched now not just with the awe of a child but with a kind of silent understanding. Something important had happened, even if he couldn't quite name it. Nearby, a university student whispered, "He never even looked at him." "Not once." "That's the whole point," her friend replied. "Some things are bigger than whoever's standing in front of you." Across the crowd, an American couple stood close, the wife speaking with quiet regret. "I can't believe he did that. Made us all look entitled." Her husband shook his head gently. "No. He made himself look entitled. The rest of us just learned what strength really looks like." Captain Hardwick remained at the edge of the courtyard, her boots planted, gaze forward. She wasn't watching the crowd. She didn't need to. Her job was done. The institution had held, and that was enough. What the president's son had expected was compliance. Recognition. Even admiration. Instead, he found himself face to face with something unfamiliar, complete indifference to the power he thought he wielded. He had dropped names. He had invoked lineage. He had made demands, trying to bend tradition to his will. None of it mattered. What he encountered was not hostility. It wasn't even rejection. It was silence. Profound, unwavering, deeply rooted silence, the kind that isn't meant to hurt, but simply refuses to be moved, and that silence had proved louder than any of his boasts. Sergeant Ware hadn't stood still as a performance. He hadn't ignored the visitor to make a point. He was simply doing what he was trained to do, fulfilling his duty, which did not include honoring noise over discipline. The difference between the two men could not have been more stark. One believed his importance should be acknowledged simply because of who he was. The other believed his duty should be upheld no matter who was watching. In that collision, something rare had occurred. Manufactured power met authentic authority, and blinked first. The tourists felt it. That's why they didn't cheer, didn't mock, didn't celebrate. They simply understood. Sometimes, the most powerful answer to arrogance isn't confrontation. It's restraint. And in that moment, it was restraint that commanded respect. As the last notes of the ceremony echoed across the stone, Sergeant Ware remained as he had throughout, unshaken. And in that stillness was the answer the president's son had been demanding all along. Real strength doesn't need to prove itself. As the final phase of the ceremony unfolded, a quiet truth settled across the courtyard. Respect cannot be inherited. It must be earned. The tourists who had come expecting photos of guards and uniforms left with something more lasting, a lesson that transcended politics, nationality, or status. They had witnessed a man in uniform embody something timeless, commitment without spectacle, honor without self-promotion. When the soldiers marched out, boots echoing like punctuation marks on a chapter just closed, not a single camera flashed. The crowd simply watched, breath held in reverence. Captain Hardwick stepped back into the palace without another word. Her presence, like Ware's, didn't need further explanation, and Sergeant Ware? He stood exactly as he had before the incident began, motionless. Disciplined, present. The demands, the shouting, the need for recognition had all bounced off him like raindrops on granite. They hadn't touched him. They never could. Back outside the palace gates, the president's son sat in silence inside his SUV, the noise now behind him. But the silence? That would follow him, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had learned something in that courtyard. That in a world obsessed with visibility, there is still a form of strength that commands rather than demands. That authority earned through sacrifice will always outweigh the illusion of power handed down through name alone. The guards remained. The tourists dispersed slowly, changed. And Buckingham Palace, like it had for centuries, stood indifferent to fame but deeply aligned with duty. Back in the polished interior of the black SUV, the president's son stared blankly through the tinted glass. The roar of London traffic passed unnoticed. The earlier swagger in his gait was gone, replaced by a silence far less familiar to him than any noise. His aides murmured into phones, already navigating the political fallout, crafting talking points, and initiating the first of what would be many damage control conversations. But he heard none of it. What repeated in his mind wasn't the denial, but the indifference. The absence of reaction. The lack of acknowledgement. He wasn't used to that, not in business, not in politics, not in life. For years, his name had been enough. Enough to open doors. Enough to stop conversations. Enough to command obedience or, at the very least, reluctant respect. But today, it had meant nothing, and perhaps for the first time, he glimpsed a painful truth: his power wasn't real power. It was borrowed. Projected. Dependent on others believing in it. What he had encountered was something his name could not purchase, a man whose authority came not from status, but from service. A man who had faced down death, not cameras. Who stood firm, not for applause, but because that's what discipline demanded. For all his wealth, his political access, his inherited influence, the president's son had never truly been tested. Not in a way that required him to stand silent in the face of pressure. Not in a way that asked him to sacrifice comfort for principle, and so, as the motorcade pulled away from Buckingham Palace, what lingered behind wasn't just embarrassment. It was a quiet reckoning. A confrontation not just with a guard, but with what he thought made him important, and the realization that it never really had. In the courtyard, long after the motorcade vanished, the crowd remained. Some stood in reflective silence. Others sat along the rope barriers, their phones now lowered, not because they lacked footage, but because they had captured something far more profound than video. The confrontation had passed. The ceremony had resumed. But something in the air had changed. It wasn't just the lesson, it was the witnessing of it. Each person there had seen more than just a man in uniform. They had seen what values look like when they're lived rather than spoken. And that changed how they saw themselves. The young boy who had saluted first stood beside his father, no longer fidgeting. He looked up, eyes wide, not with confusion, but with clarity. His small act had started a chain, one that reminded everyone watching what honor meant. Nearby, a teenager reviewed her footage but chose not to post it. "Feels wrong," she said. Like this wasn't meant to be a spectacle. Her friend nodded. This wasn't about views. It was about values. Even tourists who hadn't fully understood the significance of the ceremony before now saw it as more than tradition. It was a living code. A daily discipline. A reminder that duty doesn't begin when the cameras roll, it begins long before. And it endures long after. In an age where recognition is demanded and applause is expected, they had seen something stronger, respect that exists in silence, and as they eventually turned to leave, scattered across time zones and countries, they carried more than souvenirs. They carried a story. One that would be told again and again, not about royalty or politics, but about a single moment when silence became the loudest voice in the square. Back within the stone arms of the palace, the changing of the guard proceeded uninterrupted. Scarlet tunics swept the courtyard with practiced motion. Rifles shifted. Boots met stone in choreographed tradition. But Sergeant Ware, he remained as he had from the beginning, still. Silent. Present, the echoes of the confrontation didn't touch him. The demands, the insults, the name-dropping, they had washed past him like waves breaking against a cliff face. His silence wasn't resistance. It was dedication. To duty. To code. To something larger than any individual ego. As Captain Hardwick observed from the periphery, her expression remained composed. But deep in her stance was something less formal, pride. Not for the spectacle that had occurred, but for what had endured through it. Unwavering professionalism. She approached Sergeant Ware once more, not to debrief, not to command, but simply to acknowledge. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. In military culture, in tradition this steeped in honor, silence speaks more than explanation ever could. He had stood his ground. Not in defiance. In devotion, the world outside would return to noise. Screens would flash, statements would be released, headlines would distort. But inside the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, the truth remained simple and quiet. a man had stood still. And by doing so, reminded everyone what real authority looks like when it doesn't need to prove itself at all. The heavy gates of Buckingham Palace closed with a final mechanical click, severing the courtyard from the clamour of London. The presidential motorcade disappeared into the tide of traffic, faceless, dark, and polished, swallowed by a city that has seen centuries of power come and go. Inside the lead SUV, the president's son sat in a silence far denser than the tinted windows around him. His phone buzzed. His aides whispered. But he was somewhere else entirely, caught in the gravity of a truth too inconvenient to ignore. This wasn't just a failed photo op. It wasn't a diplomatic gaffe. It was a confrontation between illusion and substance. He had expected reverence, automatic, reflexive, unearned. He had assumed his father's name would unlock deference like a skeleton key. But what he met instead was a wall of quiet, a man so rooted in duty, so thoroughly trained in stillness, that all noise bounced off him like wind against stone. He hadn't been shouted down. He hadn't been reprimanded with anger. He had been erased, not by force, but by irrelevance, and now, as the motorcade glided through the ancient city, he sat wordless, less shaken by the coldness of the reception than by the utter absence of any acknowledgement at all. For the first time in a long while, no one had cared who he was. It was a lesson delivered not through lecture, but through silence. A silence louder than applause, colder than protocol, and infinitely more honest. Back in the courtyard, the ceremony resumed, uninterrupted and unwavering, as if nothing had happened, and in a way, nothing had. Because the palace and its guards had not bent, not shifted, not acknowledged the presence of ego, Sergeant Ware remained in place, exactly where he had been when the motorcade first arrived. His shoulders square, his chin lifted, his weapon held at the precise angle prescribed by protocol. Unflinching. Untouched. Undisturbed, the moment hadn't passed over him. It had passed around him, like weather around a monument, but what no one could see was the steel beneath the silence. The hours of training. The combat experience that taught him to hold position even under gunfire. The lives saved not by shouting orders, but by refusing to abandon duty. The man standing motionless in scarlet was not denying a civilian request, he was honoring centuries of discipline that said, "Stand still. No matter who stands before you." A few tourists still lingered, unsure whether to stay or go, unwilling to break the spell of what they'd just seen. A little boy tugged his mother's sleeve. He didn't even move when that man yelled at him, he whispered. She nodded slowly. That's what real strength looks like. Nearby, an elderly veteran, still standing, saluted once more, this time not out of ceremony, but out of respect. Not for a soldier who had stood still for attention, but for one who had stood still despite it. No medals had been awarded. No official words were spoken. But everyone in that courtyard knew they had just seen something holy, the kind of character that doesn't need to explain itself. As the crowd began to thin, conversations softened to murmurs. There were no debates. No sides to choose. Just the slow realization that they had all witnessed a shift, a moment where the weight of dignity crushed the noise of ego. The president's son would return to a world where names still carried influence, where appearances still opened doors. But he would never again step into a space like this, one ruled not by celebrity, but by ritual, memory, sacrifice. For Sergeant Ware, nothing had changed. He had not broken protocol. He had not spoken. He had not moved. He had simply done what he was trained to do, honor something larger than himself. Captain Hardwick returned inside without flourish. Her job wasn't to make statements. It was to ensure that those who served the crown did so without compromise. And today, they had, as the guards shifted formation and the stone beneath their boots echoed with centuries of discipline, those still watching understood what few ever grasp: respect is not an entitlement. It is not inherited. It is not given by force, it is earned, quietly, steadily, and sometimes in complete stillness. One by one, people left the palace courtyard. But they walked differently now, slower, quieter, introspective. They hadn't seen a viral moment. They had seen a moral truth made visible. Somewhere across London, the presidential motorcade continued down its route, swallowed by headlines and handlers, but back at Buckingham, the flag flew steady. The boots fell in time. And one silent soldier remained at his post, carrying forward the unshakable legacy of what it truly means to serve. If you enjoy this content, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Your subscription means a lot to me and gives me great motivation to make more videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the video.